Welcome to the Discover Mathematics series. In this video, we're going to look at how a person can use the two colored chips to determine the rules for the multiplication of integers. Keep in mind the yellow side is positive and the red side represents negative integers. Let's proceed. Okay, as we get started, I'm going to go over a little bit of notation. Then when I have the number 1 in parentheses and next to it is the number 4 in parentheses, that means 1 times 4, which we can think of as one group of 4. And we can represent that this way. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's one group of 4, 1 times 4, which we know is 4. Okay, for the next example, we have 3 times 2, which I can think of as 3 groups of 2. So it's one group of 2, a second group of 2, and a third group of 2. So here we're just working with positive numbers. There's nothing new. But we're going to think of the notation as a group of the second number. Okay? Then we're going to look at some negatives. Okay, for this example, I have the number 1 times negative 4, which I'm going to think of as one group of negative 4. So here I see that my answer is negative 4, because that's what I have. I have one group with negative 4. In the next example, I have 2 times negative 4, or 2 groups of negative 4. So just slide these down. There's 4. And I need another group of negative 4. So this gives me negative 8. I have 2 groups of negative 4, which gives me a total of negative 8. Because I'm grouping negatives. Okay, in the next example, I have 3 groups of negative 2. So there's one group, well, there's 2 groups, and here's a third group. So I have 3 groups of negative 2. So there my answer is going to be negative 6. So I have groups of negative numbers. Okay, in the next example, I have 2 groups of a negative 1. So that's going to give me a negative 1 and another group of negative 1. And so I have negative 2. So when I'm looking at this and to see what do I notice, what people should be able to notice is when you have groups of a negative number, you have a negative answer because it's what is in your groups. So you have a positive number of groups of negative numbers is going to give you a negative answer. Okay, but let's look at this example now where I want negative 1 groups of 2. I don't see how I can do a negative 1 group. But what I do know is since multiplication is commutative, in other words, I can change the order. Instead of doing negative 1 groups of 2, I can do 2 groups of negative 1. In other words, I can do the problem backwards in reverse order, so I can do 2 groups of negative 1, and my answer is going to be negative 2. That's what the commutative property allows us to do, is to reverse the order. So now for the next problem, when I have negative 3 times 2, I'm going to think of it as 2 groups of negative 3. So I'm going to think of this as 2 groups of negative 3. So when I do that, I have 2 groups of negative 3. So that's one group. And here's another group So I have negative 6. And the next problem, I'm going to think of it as one group of negative 4. Some of you may have already noticed a pattern here. And the next problem, I want 3 groups of negative 3. And so here you can see that I have a positive number of groups of a negative number, and my answer is negative. So when we look at what do we notice? We notice that anytime when you have a positive number of groups of a negative number, you're going to have negative numbers. In other words, you're putting them in piles, but they're negatives, so you're going to have negatives. Okay, that's what we want the students or people to notice. So let's see what happens when both of the numbers are negative. Well, if I go left to right, I need negative 1 groups of negative 4, which we said we can't do. And we can't do negative 4 groups of negative 1. But what we can do is think of this as, let me just cover it up, watch what happens. One group of negative 4, one group of negative 4, and then this is the negative means take the opposite, and when I do that, I flip them over and I come up with positive. And so my answer here is going to be a positive 4. So what did I do there? I couldn't do negative groups of a number, so I held off on the negative. I did a positive number of groups and then flipped it over, took the opposite of it, which takes into account the negative. Okay, so again, I can't do negative 1 groups of negative 2, so I'm going to do 1 group of negative 2. Gives me this. And then, to take care of the negative, I will flip it over, and I come up with positive 2. And this one with negative 2 times negative 3, I want 2 groups of negative 3. Here's one group of negative 3, here's another group of negative 3, and now I'll take care of the opposite, or the negative, and I'll flip them over. And I come up with a positive 6. And the next one, I have negative 2 groups of negative 5, so I'm going to think of it as 2 groups of negative 5. So here's my 2 groups of negative 5, and here's my negative. I take the opposite, so I flip them all over, and I end up with positive 10. So what do I notice? What I notice, or what the students should notice, is that when you're taking a negative, you can't take a negative number of groups, but you take a positive number of groups of a negative, you're going to have a negative, then you take the opposite and you end up with positive. So when we take the opposite of the negative number of groups, they'll come up to be positive. And those are the operations working with multiplication of integers.